who don't know, say on the top right of your screen is Dr. Richard Carrier, and the top left is Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald. And I gave formal introductions last time, so I won't do that this time. But for all the people who live in Manitoba, Canada, and Alabama, United States, I thought I would summarize very simply what was discussed last time. And so Dr. Dennis MacDonald does not believe any gods exist. But he still calls himself a Christian because he holds dear, I think, some of the Christian traditions. Richard Carrier is an atheist. Just put your thumbs up, Dennis. Are you okay with calling yourself an atheist or no?
I prefer to call myself a Christian humanist.
So MacDonald says there was a historical Jesus. Carrier says that there was a 1 in 3 chance that Jesus existed historically. Both Dr. MacDonald and Dr. Carrier believe the Gospels have been heavily mythologized, so they're in agreement there. The evidence for the historical Jesus, according to Dr. MacDonald, is not directly from the New Testament, but from the traditions that came before it, that may be found in the hypothetical but very plausible Q document that the New Testament may be reflecting. The historical Jesus is one that competes with other religions such as Dionysus, as shown in the Gospel of John, Odysseus and Hector, as shown in the Gospel of Mark, and Socrates, as shown in the Gospel of Luke, for example. Unlike the Gospels, MacDonald says the Q document, or the logoi of Jesus, or the words of Jesus, sayings of Jesus, are not highly mythologized. Rather, it was a Jewish document that does not say that faith in Jesus gives eternal life. Jesus was a Jewish prophet sent for the Jews. He was like the Moses 2.0, challenging Mosaic law and replacing it with the principles of compassion. Dr. MacDonald believes that this moral vision came up from a real historical person. MacDonald says that he has 2 main lines of evidence for the content of the Q document. 1, Paul's authentic letters, and 2, Josephus' writings. For example, they both talk about John the Baptist, James the brother of Jesus, and there are concepts about Jesus that are not steeped into the fantastical or the mythical, such as the fact that he was from Nazareth, he was baptized by John, he had a ministry in Galilee, he traveled with many disciples, he was considered a teacher, and he was crucified by the Romans. All very non-mythical or non-fantastical claims. Dr. Carrier, however, doesn't think there's enough evidence to back the hypothetical Q document, but for the sake of the conversation conceded last time of its existence and described by MacDonald. However, Dr. Carrier thinks that the Q document may be emulating the book of Deuteronomy, and the Jesus figure is the new Moses. Just like Mark used aspects of Homer, maybe the Q document is using aspects from the Old Testament, which does not require a historical person. Carrier counted MacDonald in the non-mythical aspects of the Gospels, that Jesus was from Nazareth, that this too can come from the Old Testament scriptures. Carrier says that even John the Baptist sounds like a myth, symbolizing rebirth, adoption from God, and a forerunner for Jesus, written to fulfill Old Testament prophecy. Carrier says that Paul's source for Jesus was revelation and scripture alone, and the first time that this Jesus is even seen is after his death in 1 Corinthians. Carrier believes that Christianity started as a belief based on revelations, then only later Jesus was placed on earth as a real historical figure to help promote the religion. Carrier states that Paul, the earliest source for Jesus, does not mention Jesus' miracles, ministry, does not use the word disciple, Pilate, Mary, Joseph. There are no eyewitness sources for Jesus other than Paul, and that was only after the crucifixion and resurrection in a vision. All other witness accounts are after a resurrection learned by revelation and scripture alone. Carrier doesn't believe any sentence written about Jesus by Josephus was actually written by Josephus. For example, Josephus does not attempt to explain the doctrines of Christianity, but it is assumed that it's already known, something a Christian would have done. Many historians agree on this point that most, if not all, references to Jesus by Josephus was added later. Same goes for the James reference. Last paragraph. Dr. Carrier says it would be weird for Jesus to have existed in history given that so many other savior deities that were historicized in myths later didn't actually exist historically. So Jesus would have been the exception if he did indeed exist. So to sum up, Carrier believes that there is a 1 in 3 chance that Jesus did in fact exist in history, and that at the very, very least, we can doubt it. Gentlemen, how was that for a summary?
Let Dennis weigh in. He needs to unmute.
I think that's fair enough. I would add in my own comments later that I would wish that Richard would comment on how our debate is different from one he's had otherwise with people who defend the historicity of Jesus. And the other is, I challenged him to somehow explain what I understand to be the cohesiveness and compelling nature of the proclamation of Jesus in the Q document, which finds some echoes in Paul. And I want this time also to mention the Johannine tradition. But Doug, I think you did an admirable job in summarizing our positions as far as I understand it.
Well, let's see. So, gosh, there's a variety of things there. I mean, there was a little bit of confusion when you were doing the summary. It seemed like you said that John the Baptist was mentioned by Paul, which is not the case. So there might have been a few little things like that where it might have just been confusion of words. But otherwise, yeah, I think that's an accurate description of our two competing positions. And Dennis asked, what is different about this debate and others I've had? And of course, most of the other debates on the historicity of Jesus, that I've had are usually turn into Christian apologetics, right? So it's usually a lot of rhetoric, a lot of denying of evidence or asserting things that aren't true. So that's a different experience when you're dealing with a scholar like Dennis MacDonald, where we're both actually interested in the truth. We actually both have, we have an understanding of how literature gets constructed in the ancient world. And so this is actually a better debate in that sense. Is that we're actually both kind of keen to figure out why the other believes what they do. And we already grant a lot of things that Christian apologists wouldn't be willing to grant for this, like the high mythologization of the Gospels. But another difference is, now I know in Two Shipwrecked Gospels, there's a paragraph or two where Dennis defends historicity. And he does mention there Paul's reference to the brothers of the Lord. As evidence, and it hasn't come up in this debate, and I didn't know why. And actually, I wanted to ask if that was start with that. Actually, ask Dennis what he thinks about that versus the alternative theories that I've proposed.
Go ahead, Dennis.
Well, I'm not sure that I have anything particular to add to that, except that we have far more evidence for the existence of Jesus, I think. Paul talking to the Jerusalem pillars and being on the same page in many respects with them. The Johannine tradition, in my view, is very interesting. According to Papias, there was an elder John who with Aristion were other disciples of Jesus in addition to the 12, about whom there's no particular interest in a mythological background. Many scholars think, and I think with very good reason, that the elder John is the same one who wrote the Johannine epistles and begins 1 John, that which we have seen and heard and touched, we deliver as witnesses to you, and that I think we should add that as yet another strand of testimony to the existence of Jesus that often is overlooked in these texts. I'm not sure, Richard, what your beef is about the family of Jesus, Jesus's brothers, and so on. So it's hard for me to react to that if I don't have a clear idea of what you're after.
Yeah, I didn't know if you'd known what I write in Historicity of Jesus or other lectures I've given. But, well, no, in Romans, Paul says that all baptized Christians are the adopted sons of God. And he says Jesus is the firstborn of many brethren. So, in fact, all baptized Christians are brothers of the Lord. So this leads us to an ambiguous status. When he says brothers of the Lord, does he mean just rank and file Christian? Or does he mean actual biological brother of Jesus? And Paul doesn't give us enough data to tell one way or another. And similarly with the pillars, he never calls them disciples. He never calls anyone disciples. The word disciple is not in there. They're all apostles, and Paul says that an apostle is someone who has a vision of Jesus. So as far as Paul says, apostles and the ones before him were just the ones who had revelations before him. So he doesn't actually tie this into any actual events before the death of Jesus, which appears to have only been learned through Scripture and Revelation. We have to actually rule that theory out before we can get Jesus back in. And it's very difficult to do because we don't have any eyewitness documents from that period.
Well, thank you, Richard. That does help. But this is where I think your skepticism about the existence of the Q document and my optimism about it really matters. Because two of the people who are mentioned as pillars appear also in lists of people who are called disciples in the Q document. And I think you're certainly right that people are called adelphoi to kuriou, that is, brothers of the Lord, brothers and sisters of the Lord in Paul, that are not disciples, and that the word disciples of the 12 is not used. But the word 12 appeared to the 12 and appeared to James and so on. So now I know that you trust more the appearance tradition than you do the historical Jesus tradition, but if one adds the Q document, for whom there are no resurrection appearances whatsoever, I think we have confirming evidence for these pillars being, for the Q community, members of the 12.
Okay, yeah, I don't really follow the logic there. I mean, just because there was a story of the Deuteronomic teachings of Jesus that didn't include the appearance narratives, I mean, Mark doesn't have appearance narratives either. So I don't see how that necessarily argues for historical Jesus. We know the Qumran community had a council of 12, for example. So this could just be a sect, could even be the Dead Sea sect itself or an offshoot of them, having these visions that's telling them the end times have begun. And like Paul says, Jesus is the first fruits of the general resurrection. So the resurrection of Jesus was to them a sign that the end times had begun. And so I think what we're looking at is a sect that already had a council of 12, and already had a leader, or someone who became the leader, Kephas, and he had revelations. He communicated it to the 12, their council for this sect. They had confirming revelations, and it proceeded from there in this sort of like revolutionary ecstasy kind of scenario, very similar to, for example, the cargo cults and other religions where this sort of thing happens. So I don't see us getting back to before the death of Jesus on this. There's no evidence in Paul that Jesus handpicked these people in life. Paul seems to equate himself as basically similar to them because he got to see Jesus. He never has to defend himself against the argument that he never met Jesus in life, which means no one threw that argument at him. And I don't know why someone would not throw that argument at him if that had been the case. So I see when we look at the evidence, it's very ambiguous. It fits both hypotheses pretty well. You can have this revelatory religion becoming historicized later, or you could have a historical Jesus explaining the same data. So I don't see us getting to a historical Jesus with this.
Well, I would agree that the 12 could be symbolic of Israel, and it's conforming to my understanding of the Q document and Paul understanding Jesus to be a rescue of Israel, or better than Moses and Deuteronomy and so on. But the names themselves are not significant names. They don't seem to be theologically freighted. And I think the correlation of the 12 indicates that you have that as an early tradition. Papias certainly accepts it, but then talks about Aristion and John the Elder as disciples as well. Mathete, he uses the word. Doug, I wonder if we could hear some of the questions that people asked from last time.
Yeah, why not? Do we have some?
Yeah. A gentleman named Dustin Jones asks, if you have an opportunity, would you consider asking Dr. MacDonald if there's even one other example during the era of the Greco-Roman antiquity and Second Temple Judaism in which the written bio-narrative of a bona fide historical figure was so thoroughly and repeatedly constructed in such a dense mimetic layers akin to what we find with Jesus in the Gospels? You're muted.
Am I on yet? There I'm on.
Yeah.
Yes, I think you can. There are lots of examples. One example could be the Testament of Abraham. I don't believe in a historical Abraham, but Abraham certainly has, to take a look at the Testament of Abraham as an example. It has wonderful imitations of not only the book of Genesis, but also of Plato's myth of Ur, and the washing of Odysseus's feet by Euryclea. I think if we'd be sensitive to the use of mimesis throughout, not just Jewish literature, but Greco-Roman literature. Here's another example, Aesop. We don't know anything about a historical Aesop, but we do certainly know that there are biographies of Aesop that even talk about his death and so on. So I think we have a lot of examples. Now, in this case, I would make a case for either Abraham or Aesop, but we do know that these legends are highly mimetic and were influential and represent culturally something important, which I think last time I felt we didn't take seriously enough. And I mentioned it earlier, the nature of the moral vision in the Gospels, especially in the Q document, and the tradition that somebody died because of that moral vision. I find that quite compelling.
Rick, did you want to add anything to that or say anything?
Yeah, right. I mean, I think that kind of missed what the questioner was going for, right? So if all the examples we have of this kind of mythically constructed text are of non-existent people like Abraham and Aesop and stuff, doesn't that actually argue for the same thing being the case in Jesus? Why are we making an exception for Jesus and saying he's the one who's historical? So I think what the questioner wanted to know is, do we have any people that we do know existed, but whom this kind of heavy mythologization occurred upon? Now, I don't personally think that question is terribly probative for this, but that I'm trying to reconstruct what the questioner is asking, right? I think.
Well, I find your comment strange because you also know about the fabulous histories of Alexander the Great and Apollonius of Tyana, and such mythologizing of historical characters is really quite extensive.
But the questioner is asking for that specific time period, let's say between 0 and 100. Is there any other examples, or you can even expand a little bit further, is there any other examples where someone actually existed in history, but it was mythologized to the extent, and the use of mimesis to the extent of Jesus?
Yeah,
well, I think that's a difficult comparative question.
Yeah, I agree.
Because you've limited it to 1 century. We have other such kinds of material. Some people have argued that Third Maccabees is written during the same time, and some of the characters in Third Maccabees may actually be historical. So if we spread it out, I think we have lots of examples.
Yeah, sorry, I have the sun coming. I'm trying to figure out where to put my head.
So I think this question is or did you want to say something to that, Rick?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think historical persons can get as historicized or as mythologized, or mythologized in the same way, I would say. But I think the question we have is, for all those others, we actually have evidence that they existed that we don't have for Jesus. And I think that's the problematic issue. And there are aspects of the mythologization of Jesus that aren't common for historical persons. But that gets into the technicalities of comparative studies of all of these things. I don't think we can cover that here in this debate.
Okay, Rick, I have a question from you from a guy named...
I agree with that, if I might, but I want the viewers to know that one of us is dressed like Darth Vader and the other like Princess Leia. So if you want to know who the angel of light is, you can see it there. And by the way, I also don't have a helmet on. So there you go, Richard.
Yeah, I know. I've got this Halo sitch going. I apologize. But anyway.
So Rick, yeah, it's like I have a devil on one shoulder and an angel on another.
That's right, you do. Except neither of us are devils. We're all right.
John MacDonald asks, I think this is for you, Rick. If mythologizing, why create Jesus to be a typical fallible prophet like in Mark 6:5 and have his detractors accuse him of being a drunk and a glutton like in Matthew 11:19?
Yeah, I mean, there's a variety of reasons. I mean, it's very similar to the countercultural hero narrative we have for Aesop. In fact, it's very similar. But also, I think the narrative that's written about Jesus is very much meant to be a usable narrative for Christian missionaries. Because if you notice the things that he gets accused of, and the things he does publicly anyway, like exorcism, healing, and the things he gets accused of, and the arguments he has to encounter are exactly the kinds of things that the missionaries had to deal with, like being called crazy. Paul even mentions this, that you got to watch it because people will call you crazy if you speak in tongues in public or something like that without explaining to them what's going on. So I think the mythology is written specifically to be in this, to serve this function. Otherwise, why would they even record it, even if it was true? Remember, right? So it's like there's no reason for them to preserve embarrassing stories at all. They only preserve them if there's a purpose. There must serve some function. There's a reason they put them in there, and that reason will be there whether the story is true or not. And that's why you get the weird stories like the withering of the fig tree, which clearly never happened. There's no way Jesus withered a fig tree. But it says, it has Jesus say that he's withering the fig tree, cursing it for not bearing figs, even though Mark says it wasn't even the season for figs. So he's depicting Jesus looking like a madman. But he's doing that fictionalizing. That's a fictional story. He made that up. So he chose to depict Jesus doing that. And it's all because it's allegory and symbol. He's actually trying to tell that story as a story that you can tell to allegorize and explain something. In this case, it's the destruction of the temple cult. The fig tree represents the Jewish temple cult. And it's a whole parable about that. So you can't really rely on that, because if the story is preserved, it must have served some function. There's a reason they preserved it. And it usually has some sort of missionary function or some sort of explanatory function in terms of explaining the gospel, which means it would have served that function whether they invented it or not.
Dennis?
Well, I hope this is the same John MacDonald that has been emailing me and that I've been responding to. John, it's an excellent question. And there are many more examples of that kind of embarrassment that can be multiply explained, but it's difficult to explain them all with a single hypothesis. And I could go on. The fact that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist becomes an embarrassment. The fact that Jesus is called a glutton and a friend of tax collectors and sinners could be understood to be an embarrassment. Some people have said that the triumphal entry has elements in it that are embarrassing. So it's possible, Richard, I think, that the early Christians were doing White House spin of fake news in creating fake, an alternative to the fake news. But I actually think that these authors inherited problems in the tradition, especially Mark's trying to correct problems that he saw in the Q document. I'll just give you one example. My reconstruction of Q says that Jesus predicted that he would destroy the temple and build another. Well, if you're writing after the Jewish war, you know that Jesus didn't show up, but the temple is in ruins, and that's why Mark has to put the temple word on the mouth of false witnesses. Now, the problem with my own argument is it's not so clear that Jesus himself said he would destroy the temple and build another. One could argue that that's a part of the polemic of the Q document. But I think John's general point is right on target, that there's a lot in the New Testament that either is theologically unfreighted or embarrassing, and the gospel authors are unlikely to have created these narratives for problems that they didn't perceive that it had already existed.
Dennis, when do you say the Gospel of Mark was written? You're still muted.
Oh, he's muted. That must have been an accident.
You have to unmute yourself, Dennis.
Am I on now? Can you hear?
Yeah.
I would say it probably between 75 and 80, shortly after the Jewish War.
Okay, my response to your response for that question is, if it's that far removed from the historical Jesus, whoever wrote that about the embarrassing stuff would be 75 to 80 years old. Would they even remember those sorts of things? Would they still be alive?
I think the issue is community memory and a memory as deposited in the Q document. I would date the Q document into the early 60s, and that's not that far removed from the historical Jesus, though it is, 2 or 3 decades later.
Oh, so you believe the Q document came after Paul?
Yes, more or less around the same time. Paul's last letter probably was somewhere between 62 and 64, and I would date the Q document around the same time.
Composed in Greek, right?
Composed in Greek.
And
Yep.
but it's based on Deuteronomy, like making Jesus the updated Moses from Deuteronomy.
Yeah. Right.
And of course, I would say that explains a lot of this stuff too. Is of course they're doing those kinds of conversions. All of that stuff. I mean, there's been tons of literature. This isn't just me, but there's lots of literature out there that takes a different view on things like the John the Baptist. I've cited several examples of scholars who pointed out that John the Baptist thing is not embarrassing in Mark at all. There's no reason for it to be embarrassing. It only becomes embarrassing in later authors when the theology of Jesus was changing, and that was later. That was way after. So we can't really get to that. In fact, the way Mark depicts it, he has John the Baptist, this famous guy, declaring Jesus his successor, and then enacting a ritual of baptism to mythically explain what a baptism is. This is just perfect example of something that they would make up. Like it's too convenient for Mark, actually, for Jesus to have had this encounter with John the Baptist and John the Baptist to declare him his successor and the Messiah. Like that's not embarrassing at all. It became embarrassing later, but that's because the myth had to change because the theology was changing. And if you look at the other things, the missionaries themselves, the Christian missionaries themselves, were being attacked with these arguments. Why are you going to taxpayers and sinners? Why are you preaching this to these rabble? So they invent a story. They have Jesus do it and say, yeah, because look, he did it. And look at those elites. They were wagging their heads at him. They're actually just representing and embodying, they're acting Christ-like, as we would say today, right? So they just create a story that has Jesus do what they're doing to justify and explain what they're doing. And I think that's, when you look at the Gospels, time after time again, each one of those pericopes, it's a story being told to communicate something about the Gospel, and often symbolically, like the fig tree narrative. I don't see any of this as looking like reminiscences, and this isn't arbitrary collected lore either. It's very tightly literarily organized with plot structure and everything. So I don't see this as coming from collected lore. I see this as deliberate literary construction to communicate a point. And they wouldn't include things that were embarrassing. There wouldn't serve any reason for them to do that. They could just leave it out. Because these aren't texts written to combat, these aren't apologetic texts. They aren't written to combat people who are attacking Christianity. They're written for missionaries to actually preach the gospel. And as that, they're just going to leave out things that aren't convenient or that serve no function. And if they serve a function, they would serve that function whether they're false or true.
Well, actually, I want to leave the John the Baptist piece out. My Q and most Qs have John the Baptist already as an issue for the Johannine community, and the passage about being a wine glutton and so on is in the context of giving John some credence. Actually, I lost my other thought, which was the major one I wanted to communicate to you. I agree with you entirely that these Gospels are not written as apologetics, but they are written as an apologetics for Jesus to the community, to the believing community. And there are certain things that had already, by the time of Mark, become problematic. And you can't attribute them just to what Mark concocts. Now, some of these can be demonstrated, I think, in the Q document.
How do we know that, actually? How do we know anything in Mark was problematic? What do you base that on?
Oh, one of my new books that's coming out is in fact on Mark's redaction of the Q document, and he's really not very happy with the Q document over and over and over again. So that the Q document has already created some problems, and I think the Q author already inherited some problems.
Well, that's just like Matthew being upset with what Mark did, but Mark not being upset by it, right? So like if we had someone who fictionalized Jesus, and then Mark doesn't like that fictionalization, so he rewrites it. Matthew didn't like Mark's fictionalization, so he rewrites it. Luke didn't like Matthew, so he rewrites it. John didn't like any of them, so he completely rewrites it. This doesn't get us back to history. It just means that they're arguing over what the fiction should be.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that. I actually want to take your image and make a different kind of point. That is, I think this business about mimesis of classical Greek poetry calls into question the whole definition of the gospel genre, as though there's a special genre out there and people wanted to write a gospel and they did this gospel, because these things are not generically oriented. They're genetically, they're not generically connected. They're genetically connected. And that's what you just did. You talked about Matthew using Mark, Luke, in my view, using Mark and Matthew, John knowing the synoptics. And the reason they have these generic similarities is they're genetically connected. I would simply put that genealogy. I know you do. And I would put that genealogy back to Mark's use of Q. Then the question is, what can we say about the proclamation of Jesus and the issues that the Q author was trying to wrestle with? And I wish that I could say that was not in shadowy territory. It is difficult to make. By the way, I think I agree with you. Most of the criteria that have been used in the past to establish the historical Jesus are problematic. So you're not hearing me talk about a lot of the dissimilarity business and so on. But I think there's a certain amount of trust that one can give to early testimony, even if one doesn't agree with the testimony. For example, I think Papias is extremely important, and I think his solutions to the synoptic problem were all wrong. But he certainly inherited a problem of different sequences in the Gospels and did his best to put them in order. I'm going to turn my mic off and let you guys talk.
Well, I have a question for Dennis. Let's imagine. Rick, I'll give you an opportunity to respond to that before I ask if you want.
No, I have nothing to add. I
okay.
That was useful.
So Dennis, let's say I had an envelope, and inside the envelope it had the correct answer, whether Jesus existed or not. Okay? And I open it up, and I pull it out the right answer. This is from God himself. This is divine revelation. So I open the envelope up, and wouldn't you believe it, it says that this Jesus did not exist historically. Now, my question for you is, if this Jesus did not exist historically, what would you expect to be different with the Gospels? Or how would you explain what you see?
Well, I think that's a better question for Richard, honestly. If Jesus didn't exist, how do you explain the materials that we have? So I think the real question is a question for Richard. What I would think if Jesus did not exist, what would be missing would be an explanation for the radical.
I'll ask Rick the same question, but first I would like you to still play in this thought experiment. Let's say we knew with 100% certainty that Jesus did not exist. Do you think you could come up with an explanation for what we do see in the Gospels and the Epistles?
No.
Can't even try?
I mean, no. One could explain a lot of the material there, but it would be a Herculean task to take a look at all of the witnesses that we have to Jesus and to then construct an alternative explanation of their genesis. So I probably, this is one of the ironies of this conversation for me. The same people that have attacked Richard in the past have attacked me in the past.
Yeah.
So in some cases, we're on the same team. We both acknowledge the mythologizing of these texts. We both agree that they are genetically connected to each other. We both agree that it's difficult to go from the surface of the Gospels to reconstruct the historical Jesus. So the places, so this is a strange argument for me, because usually my work is attacked by people who are Christian believers in a way that is not the case for me. So it's actually refreshing for me to have this argument with someone I consider to be an intelligent friend. And to
Are you talking about me or Rick?
No, I'm talking about both of you. I'm talking about both of them. I had Rick mostly in mind because we've done this kind of thing before, casually.
Yeah.
So I find it to be refreshing, but I find it to be frustrating that I'm taking it on the chin, both from my evangelical students and from, if we might say, the theological left. But yeah, to be clear about your question, Doug, and Richard and I would both say that there is much mythologizing that happens already in the Q document in order for early Christians to make Jesus competitive in the religious marketplace of antiquity, whether it's Jewish or Greco-Roman. My problem is that I cannot explain everything according to that model. That there are certain things that are unfreighted, that are not mimetic, for which I don't find analogies, and maybe Richard's smarter than I am. That would be easy to do, or to be, that maybe he's got better explanations for them. But I find that there is a grounding of Jesus' memory that goes well beyond the things that I can trace mimetically.
Okay, yeah, Dennis, if you want to mute yourself, I'm going to be fair and ask a similar question to Rick. So, Rick, I open the envelope, and it says in the envelope that Jesus did, in fact, exist as a real person in history. And my question to you is, where do you think you went wrong?
I would just update my priors. In my case, that's Bayesian terminology. No, we just didn't have the information, right? So the information was misleading. And so, for example, the ambiguity and silences in Paul's letters were weird. But that means, when I say like there's a 1 in 3 chance of that, I'm granting that the envelope might have that he existed. It's 1 in 3. So it just means if it occurred, it was less likely to have produced that evidence. But unlikely things happen all the time. So if you give me evidence that says, oh, actually, that unlikely thing did happen, I go, well, then I update my priors and conclude that it did. That's how we update our evidence and our conclusions based on information. So I don't really have to explain anything causally. I've already done that in the sense that I've explained, like, this is unusual, meaning it's improbable. But improbable does not mean impossible. It doesn't mean it absolutely didn't happen. So there's a lot of you have the same kinds of explanations as to why does Paul never talk about the ministry of Jesus? Why does he never cite a parable of Jesus? Why does he never mention Jesus as an exorcist or a miracle worker? You can come up with theories for this, and of course historicity defenders do. I just think they're unlikely, but unlikely doesn't mean impossible. So
Rick, what you just said,
that in general.
What you just said, Rick, it was the most compelling argument to me, because it's a very layman type of argument. And to be full disclosure, I lean more towards Dennis MacDonald's view. But that argument that you made, as a former fundamentalist Christian, I had to step back and go, this is really, really strange. The very first writings we have about Jesus mentions nothing about Mary, nothing about Joseph, nothing about Pontius Pilate, nothing about disciples, that term that's specifically used, nothing about the miracles. And I'm going, but this is the very first stuff we know about Jesus, and it's all absent. I mean, it mentions none of that stuff. So, Dennis, Do you feel what I'm feeling? Like that this is a very strong expectation type argument?
Not quite. But let me say, Richard, I thought that your answer was a very good one, because you do allow the possibility for historical Jesus inside your model.
Yeah, absolutely.
My answer probably isn't as sophisticated because I come from a different position. If I can't explain how it came about theologically or mimetically, then and I can't explain those data, then I think that they come from perhaps historical memory. And this brings me to my answer to Doug. Doug, my orientation would be a bit different. I think there are mimetic reasons for the creation of Joseph of Arimathea and Judas Iscariot and Mary Magdalene and so on, because of the mimetic needs that Mark had to create a compelling narrative for Jesus. But that doesn't mean that there is not, and I think Richard would agree with this, at least potentially, that there is not a what one might call, I suppose, an active oral tradition, whether it goes back to Jesus or not, that Paul inherits and that his churches can trade on. Mm-hmm. So there are places, for example, in the book of in Romans, where there are very strong parallels, moral parallels in teaching, paranesis, as we call it, between the Q document and what Paul is writing. And he doesn't ascribe it to Jesus, but he uses these aphorisms as though they're well known in the community. Unfortunately, because Paul is not writing a narrative, and he's not writing to a community that needs to know about the things according to his theology, since it's so oriented, as Richard talks about correctly, to the cross and resurrection, that I just think that we can assume that there's a lot more cultural capital going around that Paul can evoke without having to appeal to these narratives. But it is striking that the narratives are missing, and almost and many of the most significant characters in the gospel presentation, especially in Mark, are entirely absent in Paul.
So, Dennis, history is about figuring out what probably happened in the past, correct?
Okay, yeah.
So I appreciate when Rick says a 1 in 3 chance or 33% chance that Jesus existed in history, because it's putting a probability on it, what probably happened in the past. Do you say that you're 100% confident or convinced that Jesus exists in history, or do you put a probability on it like 99, 98?
I would put a probability on it of probably 80% to 20%. The issue for me that pushes it over from 100% positive is that you do have this mimetic impulse in the Q document to portray Jesus as the prophet like Moses. But the part that gives me more confidence is that you do have this coherent moral vision that one can understand would have produced a crucifixion. And the crucifixion of Jesus, I think one can say, is multiply attested. So it's the kind of moral vision and radicalism of Judaism that could have got him into trouble. I'll give you an example. I just got done teaching a course on the Gospel of Matthew, and we spent quite a bit of time with Q, and I had an Israeli Jew in class. And several times he says, if I were Jew living back then, I would have crucified Jesus too if I had the chance. So it's that, so I don't think it's 100% probability. But if Jesus didn't exist, then I still want to know who was the radical Jewish genius that tried to reconceptualize Mosaic law according to compassion. And if it isn't Jesus himself, then that other person is the one that I want to esteem.
Okay,
because
now
I am so compelled.
Well, how are the teachings of Jesus any different from the teachings of Hillel?
Oh, they're marvelously different from the teachings of Hillel. Hillel never would have argued that somebody else could be a replacement for Moses. The issue for Hillel is when you have Mosaic law, how does one make it, let's say, more generous and flexible than the school of Shammai?
Yeah, just like the teachings on the Sabbath, for example, Hillel taught essentially the same thing Jesus is portrayed as teaching. So there doesn't really seem to be a difference there.
Oh, no, not on that point, maybe. But Hillel isn't going to say that he or somebody in his circle is the new Moses and can say, as Matthew is going to paraphrase it, you have heard it said of old, but I say to you. That's not how Hillel works.
Well, what about moral? I meant moral teachings. I mean, because that's different. Because that's a theology question. So that would be the sectarian difference. The differences between sects would have different theologies, and so that would be their theological difference. But I thought you were talking about like morally radical teachings rather than just some sort of theological concept.
No, I think what you find is a moral criticism of the Jewish law goes far beyond anything that you'd find in contemporary Judaism. But let me be really clear. I do not think that the Q document was written by a Christian. And it was written by a Jew, but a Jew who was really pushing the envelope for lowering the wall that separated Jews and Gentiles, but still is Jewish. And what followers of Jesus found is that was a moral vision that they could run with and then divinize Jesus in a way that the Q document never did, and certainly Jesus would have been embarrassed by.
Okay, so like the atoning function of the death of Jesus is not in your logoi. It's not in Q. You think? I see him nodding.
Yeah, Dennis said something very interesting to me, and I thought, like, if this Jesus did not exist, then who came up with these moral teachings? And I guess my question to you, Dennis, is why does it have to be one person? Why couldn't it have been a group of people?
It could be a group of people, but I'm sure that the Q document was written by a single individual who recrafted it. I sometimes have told my students that the real hero of the Q document may be the author and not Jesus. And Jesus may have been the opportunity for the author to show his own radical vision of Judaism. So I don't know if that's helpful, but it could be that the real hero of the Q document is the author.
Yeah. Okay, on that theme, let me ask another question that's related to this then. A lot of scholars, and Dale Allison most prominently, have argued that the Sermon on the Mount had to have been written after the Jewish War, that it's actually a post-war text, and therefore couldn't have been written by Jesus, couldn't have come from Jesus. What's your take on that perspective? Oh, we need you to unmute.
Yeah, here I'm on now.
Okay.
As you know, Richard, the big issue is what does one do with the parallels with the Gospel of Luke? And central to my understanding of the Q document is what I would call inverted priority, where a document manifestly written later than the extant sources contains information that is more primitive. And over and over and over again, Luke contains content that's similar to what one finds in Matthew, but in a more primitive version and in a more primitive sequence and with more primitive concerns. And I think Dale Allison is one of the finest New Testament scholars we have. So I appreciate you giving attention to him, and he merits that attention. He has not tried to reconstruct the Q document, though he has said some very interesting things about the Q document and holds to a version of the Q document hypothesis. But I think there is way too much information in Luke that's more primitive than what we find in Matthew that likely comes out of a Q document that is written before the war.
Okay, I get it. I see what you mean by your Q theory. Your particular logoi theory is really key to your position, because a lot of things, it always lands back there. Where I think it seems more obvious to me that Mark wrote, then Matthew wrote, then Luke is just rewriting Matthew, and I think like what you call primitive structure is just Luke simplifying Matthew, and that's a whole separate debate. But yeah, I can see what you mean. Like if we posit that there was some earlier version of the Sermon on the Mount that has been changed after the war, and all we get to see are the changed versions, then that would work as a model. The question then is, how do we know that's what happened as opposed to something else?
Well, let me go just a little further, if I might, and I'll just, as an aside, I think Luke knew Matthew.
Oh, right.
I'm
Yeah,
one of the-
I know you and I have always agreed, or have long agreed on that. Yeah, I forget.
Right. The question is whether
I forget that there's
Luke knows
don't.
more than the sources we have, and I would use the principle of inverted priority.
All right.
Some people that are in the chat, I think, don't truly understand, Rick, your position on the cosmic Jesus.
Okay.
So do you want to maybe just summarize that, and where do you think this cosmic Jesus actually came from?
Yeah, I think there, as I talk about it on the historicity of Jesus, I think there's indications in Philo that there was already, certainly we know for sure that there was already an archangel who had all the attributes that are assigned to Jesus. You could argue over whether he actually was aware that that archangel was already called Jesus. And I discussed the evidence in Historicity of Jesus, but we'll put that aside. All of these peculiar features, the firstborn son of God, also later the high priest of the celestial temple, the agent of creation, the God's agent of creation, and all of these other properties. You can go down a list of along these peculiar features. Philo talks about there being this archangel who was the first Adam, the spiritual Adam, the celestial Adam, different from the one that was made out of clay, right? And when you look at Paul is clearly talking about the same figure. What has happened, if there was a historical Jesus, what you'd have to say is that very quickly people assumed, for one reason or another, that Jesus was that archangel become incarnate. Now, who thought that up when it started? That's a whole separate thing. In my view, we just get rid of the middleman on that one and just say there wasn't even a historical Jesus. There was just this archangel. And you had a sect, like a sect at the Dead Sea, that's already talking about the end is going to come anytime now. There's going to be the celestial Messiah that's going to descend and do all of these things. If you have these teachings and you're looking for these things, and you realize in Scripture you have this revelationary movement, whether it's inspiration or subconscious giving you a dream or a hallucination, whatever it is, they realize that they can explain and solve a lot of problems in Judaism by supposing that the Messiah actually did begin the end of the world through his incarnation and death. And that atoning function eliminates the need for the temple cult, so you can get rid of that whole problem of physical violence was centered around the temple cult. Corruption was centered around the temple cult. So you could actually take God directly to the people this way. And you could gain salvation through the atoning sacrifice of this Messiah. So if you had this vision that this event had occurred, it would be very analogous to Satan's war in heaven, right? So this is a historical event in Jewish theology. Satan rebelled against God and was cast down. And in the actual beliefs of the time, he wasn't cast down into hell. He was cast down into the air, the sky. He lives up there and manipulates the world through demons and stuff up in the lower heavens, as they say. So that's well-established Jewish lore. And so you have this historical event that people believe in that didn't really happen, but it's happened in the celestial sphere, this sort of event. So my theory, and this isn't mine, this is actually Earl Doherty, to my knowledge, is the first to really clearly articulate it. So I call it the Doherty thesis, although I think he added too much stuff to it. So I simplify it, strip it down to its bare minimum. But the Doherty thesis is that this is what originally happened, that someone had, Kephos, for example, had this revelation that this event had occurred, this other event that reverses the fall of Satan. And this is the voluntary sacrifice of the Messiah. He finds it confirmed in Scripture. He's got this pesher that he's constructing or using. And we see that in Paul. He says, the crucifixion, death, burial, resurrection of Jesus are all confirmed in Scripture. They're learned from Scripture, and then people see him. And so that's the order of events you see in the Creed in Paul, is that people see Jesus only after this event has occurred. So it's It's a celestial event of some kind that was not known and not seen by anyone. And even Paul says in Romans 16, 25 to 26, that it was hidden until just now, and only known through the scriptures and Revelation that this happened. So that's the celestial Jesus hypothesis that I think is the one that most likely competes.
So can I sum it up as saying that you guys have heard the Antichrist, a lot of the conservative Christians talk about the Antichrist coming. Was Jesus the anti-Lucifer to solve the sin problem? And
very much, right? He's depicted that way in every respect, right? He's revert, and you see that in 1 Corinthians 15, the whole discourse in 1 Corinthians 15 is about Jesus, how his act is going to reverse and overpower Satan. It's all this way of how do you overcome all the sin that Satan brought into the world, and death particularly. Satan is blamed for death. So Jesus is the anti-Satan. He's also the anti-Isaac in a way, right? Because when Abraham was supposed to sacrifice Isaac, God said, okay, stop. I'll let you substitute an animal. And that began the Yom Kippur, the annual atonement sacrifice. You sacrifice this animal. And it's a substitutionary sacrifice substituted for Isaac, the son of Abraham, his firstborn son. Jesus is, in this theology, is the firstborn son who's being substituted back in for the animal. That's why his sacrifice actually lasts forever. You don't have to repeat it every year. And I'm practically quoting Hebrews 9. This is basically Hebrews 9 explains this in detail as the theology of it. That's the underlying theology. And my view, the Doherty thesis view, is that the Hebrews theology is actually the origin of the faith. It's not a later development. Now, of course, the mainstream view is the Hebrews view is the later development mapped onto a historical Jesus. And those are the two competing hypotheses that you have.
So I want to get Dennis in here. Dennis, what you just heard from Rick, is this all nonsense to you, or how much of this do you agree with?
Well, I'm going to ask Richard a question first, just to get a little more clarity.
Sure.
But for everyone, there can't be any doubt, in my view, that Paul is interacting with various mythological constructions on the meaning of Jesus, and some of them are very close to what one finds in Philo. And certainly for Paul, the issue is, in what way is the death and resurrection of Jesus a cosmic event, and what is the benefit of it? The way Philo wants to talk about it often, not always, but often, is in the context of a first and a second Adam. So that the first Adam is created in God's likeness, and it's the kind of best state of the human. The second Adam is the Adam that is created out of flesh, and it's the way that humans are now, and sin came into the world and death. And Richard's quite right in appealing to Paul's theology in 1 Corinthians 13 as a corrective of that. The last enemy to be conquered is death. But that's after the death of Jesus, but with his return, presumably. But Paul feels somewhat uncomfortable with that, because he wants to affirm the physicality of Jesus's resurrection. Although I should be careful, it's not physicality, it's embodiment that he's more interested in, but it's a spiritual body. So this is a very different kind of mythology than the ones that inform the gospel creation. That is, they come more out of Greek philosophy, if you will, Middle Platonism, which I know Richard knows quite a bit about. And this is, I think, a topic that gets overlooked by many conservative interpreters of Paul. There is, in fact, this heavy Jewish mystical overlay to the interpretation of Jesus that centers on Jesus's death as a cosmic event, and is often related to the first and the second Adam. But I think in some cases one can see that Paul feels a little uncomfortable about that, and is interested in not so much physicality, but embodiment, and more of a connection with traditional Judaism than is sometimes given. But I'd be interested in Richard's response to that. I think that there is a lot to be said about the Platonic parallels in the Pauline circle. I'm not sure Paul always is comfortable with it, and I certainly wouldn't want to say that the very idea of Jesus was generated from it.
Yeah, actually, I think Paul's theology is eclectic, and I think this is one thing a lot of people who talk about ancient philosophy miss, is that actually eclecticism was much more popular than specific sects. So people would pick and choose like a salad bar from different philosophies. And when you look in Paul, Paul has a lot of Aristotelian and Stoic ideas in there as well. And there have been scholars who've published articles on these points too. So I think there is a lot of Middle Platonism, and theologians like Philo and Paul definitely loved Middle Platonism because it was very friendly to religious people in a way that its exact opposite, which was atomism, Epicureanism and other atomist philosophies were very unfriendly to religions. So they picked less from those philosophies, but picked more from the theology-friendly ones. And that was Stoicism, which had like the whole theology of the Holy Spirit. That's very Stoic. It comes right out of Stoic theology throughout Paul and in other Christian writings. But they combine these things. They bring them together. So I do think they're getting ideas from this. But these ideas might have already entered Judaism and the Jewish sect that became Christianity before it was Christian. I think these ideas were already flowing into Judaism long before. And Philo is a representative of that in the diaspora, at least. But I'll add I don't see Paul being uncomfortable with the theology of the atonement or any of that stuff. I find when I read 1 Corinthians 15, for example, all I see is frustration with the people he's arguing with, that he's very annoyed that they would deny that there is a resurrection, which seems to be what he's attacking or dealing with, or deny that there's a resurrection with a body. It does seem that it's denying resurrection, but it might have been they were denying a body, and he found that very annoying. And there's a lot of reasons why he wants to defend the idea. No, we're going to have a super great body. It's going to be wonderful. It'll last forever. And I think it's very similar to what you read in Origen, the 3rd century Christian scholar, where he makes a point, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, the person might be a disembodied entity, but you can't live or be alive. You're manifest. That ties into what you look at Paul. He appears to be an annihilationist. Really, any references to hell in Paul. It looks like his belief is that if you don't get saved, you just stay asleep forever. Now that's disputed, and people can argue over it, but it would fit this idea. Only the saved are going to be given a resurrection body, not the damned, and that means only the saved are going to wake up to eternal life. And it looks like in his view that that's not even possible without a body. Like if you're disembodied, you're asleep. You still exist like an idea in the mind of God. That's Origen's point. It's like you're an idea in the mind of God, but if he doesn't stamp you into a body, you can't see anything or experience anything or think. So a body is essential to Paul's theology. And so his solution, of course, and this might not be his solution, it might be the one he inherited, but it's in any case, is that no, we're going to get a great body. It's going to be a wonderful super body. It's going to be much better than this messy body of flesh that we don't like. But it's still going to be a body. And to him, he's not uncomfortable with this. To him, he's annoyed by people who would think that this isn't true.
Well, I can't wait for a new body.
Yeah. No, his description of the new body sounds fantastic. I want one too.
This is a very simple question for both of you. Is there anyone who identifies themselves in history, who they are, where they're from, when they wrote it, that they themselves wrote, that they saw Jesus in flesh?
Yes, there is. Now, the issue then is, can you trust them? And that's why I think Papias's The Elder John is so interesting. He says that this Aristion and the Elder John were mathetai, they were disciples, but not members of the 12. And the author of the Johannine epistles writes, that which we have seen and heard and so on. And I'm of the opinion, as are many others, that the we there has to do with other elders, the presbytery, which means in Greek basically the old guys.
When was this written?
First John probably was written in the early 90s and seems to know the Gospel of Matthew. But here's someone who argues, an external person says he was one of the followers of Jesus and that he was still living when Papias was collecting his stuff. and that
Well, that's
author of
part of the
the
problem with that.
Johannine epistles says that he is the elder, and in 1 John he says that which we, that is the presbytery probably, the elders, those who are old, have seen, they're handing on to tradition. So I think that's a pretty straightforward answer to the question.
Yeah, I think it's quite plain that the Johannine passage is referring to the resurrection of Jesus, that they're talking about they handled and saw the risen Jesus, not the historical Jesus. Even if there was a historical Jesus, that's the passage I think is referring to visions or experiences of the risen Jesus. And for that and many reasons, I think the letter is a forgery. I think that I agree with all the scholars who cite on that side that this is a polemical series of letters that was written after the Gospels to sort of defend the faith from a particular perspective. I don't think it comes from a real John, and it doesn't even claim to. The letters don't even claim that they come from a disciple. But even if you take the we passages claiming that, I think that's the same thing as the Book of Acts making stuff up, or 2 Peter, for example, claiming to be written by Peter, and it wasn't.
I really think
so I don't
that's
think we can trust that.
I think that's a forced interpretation. In my book, Dionysian Gospel, I argue that the epistles surely are earlier than the Gospel. They're not later. And this has been shown, I think, by a number of scholars. And that the author is claiming to be a living witness going back to what they heard and saw and so on. And then there's not an interest in the resurrection of Jesus until later. What comes first is our ethical teachings that in many cases have similarities to what you'd find in the Q document, for example.
Okay. Well, then that would be the only. I'm not convinced. I don't see any reason to believe that those letters are authentic and not forged. But that would be the only instance of someone who is an eyewitness to Jesus writing about it. Yeah.
And Dennis is nodding yes, that'd be the only one. But here's my problem, Dennis. You're 70 years old, right? Roughly. If you would have lived back then without antibiotics, do you think you would still be alive to write about Jesus? Oh, you're muted.
Okay. Yeah.
This is one of the amazing things about the Johannine tradition. They valued this person's memory such that they said, Jesus will return before this old guy dies. So that when he does die, then it creates a crisis for the Johannine community.
Where is that? Where do people say that?
Well, it's in the epilogue to the Gospel of John. That Jesus did not. Okay. Yeah, Jesus did not say he would not die until Jesus returned. But if it's my will that he be alive when I return, what is that to you, Peter? So that
is that the only place? Is that the only place that tradition is attested? Do you know of other places or?
Well, the very fact that Papias talks about John as a presbytery, as one of the ancients, and that he was still a living voice that was transmitting the teachings of Jesus, I think has to be taken with some credence.
Yeah, I mean, Papias never connects the John that he's talking about with any letters or with the gospel. And I side with the scholars, and there have been several who've published on this, that the person that they're talking about in John 21 is Lazarus, not John. Because there's a really good literary case for this.
Well,
I documented in on the historicity of Jesus.
Well, I would certainly.
The question came up.
No, I would certainly disagree with that, and I've written a lot on it. But the other is that, according to Eusebius, Papias knows 1 John, and he does not know the Gospel of John. So,
but Papias also says that he was confused which John he was talking about too.
Well, because Papias says there are 2 Johns, and there's
and I think Eusebius says that there's problems there as to which John is who, and whether Papias is correct. Eusebius didn't trust Papias.
No, that's right, for sure.
We shouldn't trust him. Yeah. So
I trust him
this is
on
all
that.
complicated. There's all kinds of problems with this evidence. Yeah.
Well, it's even for people who believe in the historical Jesus, it is a question mark that I think they have to have in their head. Like, at best, we have one, maybe two people saying who they are. And even the example you
Documents.
gave. Yeah. They identify themselves as someone who are putting their reputation on the line and saying, I saw the fleshy Jesus. And it's, it's very rare. But I got to ask this question because it's from someone who donates money to me once in a while, so I can take my kids to Applebee's. Shane Zolan, he asked a long question, so I'm going to try to summarize it. And forgive me, Shane, if I butcher your real question. But how much do you think the Roman government played a part, if any, in the development of the Gospels, the promulgation of it? Do you buy any of the, some of the theories out there that...
Is this a question directed at me?
It's for both of you.
Okay. All right. This sounds like a Joseph Atwill question. I don't know.
Sort of. I think so. But why don't you go first, Rick? Do you think there's
obviously,
anything to it at all?
No, I don't. So it's called the Atwill thesis. I've written on it. Atwill's Cranked Up Jesus. You can read my article on why I think this is an example of what I consider like bad mythicism, where it's very conspiracy theory based. It's very poorly argued. It's seeing all kinds of things in the tea leaves, as it were. But for people who want to see my take on the Joseph Atwill thesis, just look up Atwill's Cranked Up Jesus on my blog, and you'll see why I don't think this has any credence. But his theory is that his theory, which goes back to the Paizo, the non-true Paizo conspiracy theory. A lot of people forget that there was a real Paizo conspiracy theory which involved the assassination of Nero. But the other Paizo conspiracy theory that was made up, I think, in the 19th century, was that the entire New Testament was a forgery by the Roman government to pacify the Jews and to trick them into being Christians. And that's kind of Atwill's thesis as well. I think it's patently absurd.
But there's one argument that kind of makes sense to me, just a very common sense type argument, and is that one verse in the New Testament that says, give unto Caesar what's due to Caesar, or something like that. That's something a Roman person would write.
Well, in Paul, Romans 13, Paul spends an entire chapter arguing how you should be obedient to the authorities, right? So there's, I think one thing is true, is that the sect very much wanted to get along and to create its own sort of government within a government and not get into conflicts with the political authorities. So they very much wanted these things to be taught. I was like, no, don't skip your taxes. Don't get into tiffs with the government. No, just be obedient. The end times will come. Don't worry. And that's what the whole turning the other cheek thing is. If someone sues you, just give them whatever they want. If someone takes your Coke, let them have it. If someone strikes you, just let them strike you, because it doesn't matter. The world's going to end any time now. Why risk sinning and losing salvation? Just endure everything that's going to happen. And then you'll get heaven really quickly. And meanwhile, they want to create this sort of ideal socialist utopia within their own community, where they're all helping each other, where they're all equals, and so on. So this is coming from below. It's not the government, the Roman government, trying to impose this on Jews. I don't even know how the hell they would pull that off. No, this is a faction of the Jews who are tired of the political violence and tired of the corruption, even in their own religion, even in their own communities, and are looking for a way out and a way to actually become more harmonized with the surrounding community and await the end of the world. And so all that stuff is coming from them, and they have very good motivations for wanting to promote it that way.
Dennis, did you have any thoughts on that? You're still muted.
Book on it. So I'll restrict my comments to just a couple of things. First, I agree with Richard 90% of what he said. So I think that hypothesis is nonsense. The second, I read Romans 13 somewhat differently, because immediately after that passage, Paul then says the form of this world is passing away. So it's not that it's favorable to Rome, but the time is growing short, that he's an apocalypticist, and there are more important things to worry about than whether you should pay taxes.
I want to emphasize that's kind of what I meant too, is that they didn't want to get into conflicts with the government. Just write it out, and don't break the law and stuff, because that's just going to create trouble for you. It doesn't matter if the political forces are against you in any sense. Just endure it, because the end is coming any time now.
Well, if I might just add this, and it's a shameless plug for a book that I've written called Luke and the Politics of Homeric Imitation. Luke acts as a rival to Vergil's Aeneid. And one might paraphrase it as Luke's construal of the kingdom of God as a rival to the Roman Empire, not in a revolutionary way we usually think of it with insurgency, but rather as a rival social religious movement that similarly has a manifest destiny to end up in Rome with the merging of two peoples, and that Vergil and Luke imitate the same Homeric passages over and over again, but Luke does it in order to show that the Christian tradition is a better exemplar of Roman values under the Augustan age, such as bringing peace, giving prosperity, having a God as a benefactor, cooperating even to a certain extent, freedom of women. And so my alternative to the thesis that Rome is responsible for the New Testament is it's responsible for the New Testament only insofar as the empire became a foil against which Christians became crafters of their narrative.
I agree with all of that. I think that's all correct.
Okay, this is going to be like a lightning round. I just want thumbs up or thumbs down.
Okay, yes. Right. Okay, wait, I have to figure out where my thumbs are.
Okay,
there we go. Okay.
I'll start off easy. Adam and Eve literally existed. Oh, you got to move your... Yeah, there you go. Okay, and mute yourself, Dennis. Mute yourself.
It's hard to get this right. Okay.
Okay. Abraham existed. Move your hand is closer to your face. There you go.
Yeah.
Okay, so both of you don't believe Abraham existed. Moses existed. Oh, wow. 12 disciples existed. 12.
Not disciples.
Oh, okay. So
okay, yeah.
Dennis is
I
is
could
not
do
sure.
that too. I could do that too if we say apostles, original apostles. But if we say disciples, then no. I think
Okay, original apostles. 12 original apostles existed. Does that change your answer? Okay, so you're on.
Yeah, I mean, there were 12, but were they the only apostles? There were more. There were more than 12. So, yeah, that's a hard one to do. I don't know how to answer that one.
Paul existed. You both agree on that one. Okay.
Yeah.
So it looks like you guys are exactly the same on everything except for Jesus.
Not everything.
Well, on who existed and
that was a fair.
Yeah, on who existed.
Oh, on who existed and who didn't.
Yes,
maybe. Yeah, at least 99, I guess, 99%.
What I learned from this, which was very interesting, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dennis, but when I asked you that probability question, which is a historian type question, like did I hear you right? You said you're 80% convinced Jesus existed, and you're leaving yourself 20% wiggle room.
Maybe 90-10 or something like that. I wish we had better external evidence. I think a certain amount of humility is necessary by all historical judges. And otherwise, if I said 100%, it more likely is coming out of a pre-critical preference. Maybe even a faith statement. No, I'm pretty sure Jesus existed, and I'm certainly appreciative of whoever it was that gave us the moral vision of an alternative Judaism that's represented in the Gospels, especially in Q.
Well, I'm going to hold you to that original 80% number, and so I can say this: that really you
80 to 90.
That you and Rick, because Rick says 33%. So really, you're only 47% off. I mean, different, which is less than half. So that's progress. Well, I'm scared that Rick's phone's going to blow up if we go much longer.
It's
So,
doing fine, but you're right. We do need to wrap it up.
So
Yeah.
I'm going to put links in the description box after we're done for both your websites and so forth. But I want to give you guys, let's say, 60 seconds to say whatever you want to say, plug whatever you want to plug, and then we'll close it off in prayer. No, I'm kidding. Dennis, why don't you go first, Dennis?
I very much appreciate Doug, you and Cam putting this together. Richard, I consider you a worthy intellectual companion, and I appreciate this conversation. I want to go back to the first thing I said the last time. I consider myself an FOCH, a frequently outraged Christian humanist. And I'd prefer that to saying that I'm a Christian believer or that I'm an atheist. I don't think that there's a God, but I do think there's a Jesus, and I don't think be skeptical about God requires us to have the same amount of skepticism that I think Richard is giving. I think the positive thing about this discussion is for me, Richard, is that we can have this discussion on the other side of recognizing the very heavy, creative, mimetic literary process that went into giving us the Jesus of the Gospels. The difference is, I think one can mine Jesus from the Gospels we have, and I think you would be willing to mine down to tradition, but would have much more suspicion about getting to bedrock Jesus in that excavation.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dennis. Rick?
I have to praise Dennis MacDonald's work too. Like every book he's ever written is awesome. So I've benefited it from a lot, learned a lot methodology as well as just literary analysis and the way he deconstructs texts and everything. I don't necessarily agree with everything in all of them, but I do think they're like valuable and important work. So I highly recommend them to anyone who's interested in studying this stuff. For myself, I've got, for those who are interested in this subject, I do once or twice a year teach a course online. Actually, I teach a course online every month on either history or philosophy, different subjects. But I do one specifically on the historicity of Jesus, where we actually look for the best arguments for and against. And in fact, this whole debate is going to create a new document that I'll be using for that in the future, because I think we've actually gain some ground here and learn some things and stuff. So I think it's kind of cool. So for people who are interested in that, look out for that. If you want to really like get in there and participate and really dig into the sources and things like that. Based on my book, of course, on the historicity of Jesus, which does a complete comparison of historicity versus what I think is the only viable theory of non-historicity. For people who really want to dig into that debate, that book right now is the one to get and to start with. And I've written some other things and stuff related to that. But also, I've developed an application for both Android and iPhone called Chrestus, Chrestus. And it's very much now still in kind of like the larval stage. We're waiting for a new upgrade where we can improve it considerably, but we're going to keep improving it over time. But what it has in it, it has two things that are really cool in the Chrestus app. One is the goal is to have every argument for and against the historicity of Jesus included in there, so you can actually go through very quickly, see what the argument is and what the response is from the other side. And we've only got about maybe 20% of that built out now, but we're building it out more and more, and it's going to keep growing and growing. And the other thing is it has a Bayesian calculator in it, so if you hate math and want to like do Bayesian analysis of things, where we assign probabilities to things, and it asks simple plain English questions as what do you think the probability of this is, and so on. And you can build it out for any set of evidence. You can even use it for any argument besides historicity, but it's in there for this. You can actually construct a Bayesian argument without even realizing that you're doing it, and it will actually do the math for you and tell you like, well, if you think the probabilities of these things are thus, then you have to conclude the probability of the conclusion is this. And so the calculator is in there. It's expandable. You can actually add items of evidence or take them away for anything. So both of those features are in Crestus. That app is on Android and iPhone. And like I said, right now it's larval. You can get in there. You can use it, tinker around. But it's going to even get better over time. We're going to keep adding stuff and improving the structure and all of that.
Thanks, Rick.
Oh, and all of this stuff, I should say, richardcarrier.info, INFO. So everything, my Twitter feed, Facebook, blog, Crestus, all of that stuff, you can find information through my blog at richardcarrier.info. And that's all you need to know.
I want to thank both of you. This has been a tremendous experience for me. I respect both of you tremendously for the work you've done. And I highly encourage people who are watching, even those fundamentalist Christians that I sometimes rail against, I encourage you to buy their books or read their material, because at the least you can get a sense of what someone who believes things opposite to you, try to understand where they're coming from. And I want to thank everybody who hung out in chat. For the most part, it was respectable in the chat. I don't think we might have had one troll, but that's it. So thank you. And you guys can just press the X on the top right and you'll exit. And
Alrighty.
I'll probably email you guys thanking you later as well. Take care, guys.
Alrighty, thanks. It was great. Yeah, be well, both of you.
Bye. Thank you, Shane. Thank you, John. Thank you, Joseph, so much for your donations. Thank you for hanging out in chat, asking questions. I apologize if I didn't get to your question. I think most of the questions, though, were answered during the course of the conversation. Thank you to Reed and Cam for moderating. See you guys next time.